Let's actually dive into the compression part because I know you have your Magic Death Eye compressor,
Hmm.
and which seems very cool. So maybe if we start, at the basic of a compressor, how if you can explain, yeah, the basic of the common knobs we find in a compressor and what they do, maybe for people who struggle with the concept a bit.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the different types of audio compression. There's usually it's an element that controls the gain. When you get louder, it wants to either keep it at one level or make it softer. Um, there's a FET, like in 1176, where the FET just hangs on the input signal, and when it gets a certain voltage into it, it grounds the signal. And then there's an opto, like in an LA2A, and that uses an electroluminescent panel, which is basically like your old style night light, whereas you plug it in, it just glows green. That is um, put to an LDR, which is a light dependent resistor, and the more light it gets, the less resistance it has. So as that panel gets brighter, it again grounds signal.
Hmm.
So there's the FET, there's the ELOP, as Manley called it, electroluminescent, and then there's a VCA, and that's used in, say, the SSL bus compressor, and that is a bunch of transistors that, um, again, they they don't. You might not call it grounding the signal, but the signal actually runs through the VCA, and the VCA turns down the signal.
Right.
And all of these, and then there's what I make, the Verimu tubes, and it's the same concept as the VCA more than the FET or the ELOP. The signal is going through the tubes and it turns the volume down.
Hmm.
But what they all use is what's called control voltage, usually picked up after the unit. And it takes the signal that's on the output, and it basically takes the AC signal and rectifies it to DC, and then puts that into whatever element is being used to turn down the music. So it's kind of like this feedback loop. The louder you get, the more signal is fed back, the more control voltage is fed back into whatever element is pulling down the music.
Right.
So um, those are the basic four ways of doing it. And there's famous compressors that use each one. And the most famous compressor that uses the tubes to turn down the signal is the Fairchild,
Hmm.
which I was always, you know, uh, infatuated with ever since the Bomb Factory Fairchild plugin came out.
Hmm.
And I was really excited when I started working at Capitol because they have they have like three Fairchilds, two 670s and a 660.
Right.
And I was like, wow. And the first night I got into the studio and I put some stuff through. To be honest, it didn't quite sound like the plugin.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't, to me, it just wasn't as controlled. And, I was like, wait a minute, man, this is not right. The plugin's sounding better. I mean, I guess I can say like texturally and sonically, it probably sounded better, but the way the gain reduction was working, it felt more out of control. It didn't feel, and that later on I learned is because usually the tubes in the Fairchild, they're old, they don't match well, and for very mu compression to work right, you have to have a very well matched tube or set of tubes.
You explain what compression is, the different types. Could you give us a brief explanation of the, for example, threshold, attack, release, uh, and their
Yeah,
relationship?
when you make that control voltage, when you turn the output AC into DC, then you can control in time how much or when that control voltage gets to the gain reducing element. So if you put a big fat capacitor on that control voltage, the control voltage has to fill up the capacitor before it can move on to the gain reducing element. So that would be time. That would be signal in time.
Right.
And you could say that could be attack, say. So attack, you make the attack slower, you put a bigger capacitor on there, and it takes longer for that control voltage to pull the gain reduction down. So if you have a snare drum and you set the attack slower, you're going to get the pop of the snare. It's going to slip through before the control voltage can pull down the volume.
Right.
And you can control that time. And the release is how fast the capacitor discharges to bring the element down as much as it needs to go. So a slower release time means it's slower to pull the voltage down. So the attack would be how fast it initially starts to pull down, and the release is how fast it comes back up.
Mm.
And then the threshold would be when it starts to do that.
Right.
So that's attack and release basically,
Cool.
and how it's with control voltage.
Yeah, makes sense.